Yeah.
Those kind of things. So then I was like, how would the Episcopal Church approach this?
Yeah, it's some people take on something, some people give up something, some people do a combination of things. I
liked your description that it should be something meaningful.
Yeah.
And not like.
Yeah, it should be something meaningful. Like, I used to give up watermelon when I was a kid, or candy. Like, I mean,
Right.
which is perhaps not ideal, but something meaningful that hopefully connects you closer to God, either when you notice you don't have the thing or when you notice you're doing the thing more, whatever it is for you. We tend not to prescribe a lot of stuff. The big Anglican saying is, all can, some should, none must. And we use that a lot.
I really like that.
Yeah.
All can, some should.
Yep, none must.
I did not realize you guys were in.
It's okay.
I'm just coming here just
dare
for
you.
your sake.
All can, some must,
All can, some should,
should.
none must.
Got
I can't tell you how many times in regular conversation we now sometimes will just say, but the incarnation.
Excellent.
That's great.
See?
Nancy Penn is the one.
See? It creeps in, I tell
It does
you.
creep in. It does creep in.
But the incarnation.
it. Meaning that God is everywhere?
Well, no, just like, it's more than just this moment. It's like all of the existence. I don't know, that's my take on it, is it's more than just this moment.
Right.
It's about everything that happened up until that moment, like, is part of that moment. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
We had some other conversation and we applied it to something else too, so it wasn't just about Jesus and the church. It was like, well, but the incarnation, like all of the moments that go into somebody becoming what they are today or something. I'm not really sure what our conversation was about, because it wasn't about church, it was something else, and
We were like, oh, that fits.
oh, but the incarnation, oh, yeah. That's what happened.
It helps.
I had a question. Once you said your thing about, I don't believe WTF is real, and you ran away, did they try and follow you?
Oh,
The rest of-
WWE?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
But then you ran into your home and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Safe actual space.
yeah. All right. I had my little nice outline all written up, and now I cannot locate it. Ah, here it is.
So we've also been doing Arabic on Duolingo.
Whoa.
Do you know, my wife took Arabic for a semester in college, and I
Hey.
knew about it. I'm like, wow, you're doing this really quick. I'm struggling with the I got the
alphabet.
right to left, and you really got the alphabet down. She's like, oh, well, I took a semester. I was like, when did this happen?
I've gone back and I'm taking the Duolingo too, once you
very
said you were
cool.
doing it. Yeah, because I don't know the writing at all. I know I can hear it, I can understand some of it.
Oh, that's
Well, I
awesome.
mean, some of the
Um,
silly part is like you go through it and you're reading out this alphabet and you're sounding it all out, and then you realize it's just an English word
Yeah,
spelled in Arabic letters, and you're like, jacket,
yeah, jacket.
and it means jacket,
Or garage.
and it means garage. Yeah.
Yes.
Ah.
But those of us
But
hope
it is
that
good-
if I could learn,
but it is
if I
good
could learn
practice.
the
the sounds
Yeah.
and-
symbolism, I can
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I need to tell you that Palestinian Arabic is fairly different from modern standard Arabic.
Good to know.
Well, it's like listening to my stepfather is Spanish. His family is just from outside of Madrid.
Yes.
I talk to the Hispanic workers, and it's like, ho ho ho.
Yeah, like an
It's
entirely
faster,
different.
It's different. There's dialect to it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I got preguntas.
Yeah.
You know?
Like they'll use entirely different words for things.
Yeah.
Like there's the sound
Yeah.
that is in modern standard Arabic that Palestinians don't use at
Oh,
all.
that's fascinating.
They'll drop letters like it's a whole. And so there was Bab, which I know from being in Palestine, and she was saying it on the Duolingo, and I was like, I don't know what that word is. And then they're like, door, and I was like, oh, that's right, because your accent is weird.
It's true. It's
That's funny.
So anyway, I found my thing. All right.
Reminds me of someone from Scotland speaking Arabic who has a Gaelic accent.
Oh my gosh, it's
So,
speaking to someone in German with a southern accent, trying to translate from book German to southern Bavarian German. You're like, okay, maybe we'll find it. We'll find it.
Nine.
Yeah.
It's fun.
So this class is going to be about church history, kind of how we get up to the beginning of the Anglican Church, and then next class is going to be kind of Anglican-y church history, how we get the Episcopal Church. So first off, there was Jesus. Jesus kind of starts everything off. We know Jesus was a guy. He lived in the Judean province of Palestine under Roman occupation. He was crucified at the hands of the Roman state. He rose again. He had some disciples, probably a small group. We do know they were very obnoxious to many people. And we have independent historical evidence for this. I think I've talked about this before. We know that a guy named Josephus Flavius, one of my favorite individuals, who was a Jewish historian of the stuff happening around this time, because he was a collaborator with Rome during a huge revolt that happened in 68 to 70 called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, where a guy comes out of Galilee, says he's the Messiah, claims to be the son of a star, which is what Bar Kokhba means, leads a Jewish army against Jerusalem and Rome. Everybody dies. It's very bad. Rome levels Jerusalem. Josephus is a collaborator with Rome at this time, and he goes back and he says, okay, my friends in Rome, I'm going to explain to you the ways of my people. And he writes these histories for them that are kind of our best independent source for what's going on in the Jewish world at this time. He's a Roman suck-up, so some of his stuff is fairly slanted. Like he goes overboard about like how the Jews of Judea didn't have any civilization until the wonderful Romans came in and occupied them. Like it's a little, but he does mention in a couple places that there was this guy, Jesus, who ran around for a couple years and then was crucified, and then his followers claim he came back to life. And then in another place, he's like, and his followers have gathered together, they call themselves the Way, and they're really obnoxious.
That's so fun and fascinating, though.
Yeah. So we know, I mean, some kind of modern material atheists will now claim there's no person as Jesus. We know there was a guy. Like, we can make other claims, that can be debated all day long. There was this guy.
And of all the people that were there, and how many things are happening,
Yeah.
we found this. This is here.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
There's this
that's
guy.
kind of amazing.
It's very,
Yeah.
it's very.
What does it refer to obnoxious? So what does he feel?
He thinks that they're very annoying. They won't go away. They keep insisting that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus was somebody important. And even though Rome keeps like killing them off and trying to educate them better, they just won't disappear. So they're very annoying to him.
Poor things.
So the early Christians, from what we can tell, met together in what we can call house churches. They met in people's homes in really small groups. Heavily localized practice, almost no cohesion.
Is this why Paul writes all his letters?
Yeah, I mean, we're not even really to Paul yet. Paul comes like in 60, 65. So Paul's a little before Bar Kokhba. But what would happen is if you had heard stories of Jesus and you kind of had become convicted, you would kind of gather with your friends and your family, other people who had heard the stories, and you would start meeting together in your house. And you would tell the stories to each other. You would talk about what was going on in your life. You would share a meal. We know that some form of the Eucharist was being practiced even as early as this. You would read letters from traveling evangelists, because letters would go from church to church or from group to group. And that's how you would stay connected to other little groups. Gradually over time, as sort of these groups began to talk more to each other, we get bishops kind of springing up to create some networks between the groups, to oversee geographical areas of the little church groups. And deacons emerge. So bishops and deacons are the first two to emerge. Presbyters don't emerge until way later, once we get into Constantine and we actually get buildings. But deacons are the ones who serve the needs of the community. We get a description of deacons in the book of Acts. It's way early. And bishops are the ones who are keeping the little church communities connected and together, kind of writing them letters, telling them what's going on, news of the world. Some of the little house church communities had some parts of what we would recognize as the New Testament. Others had other parts. Some of the house groups saw themselves as Jewish and within that tradition. Others did not, particularly once Paul kind of gets up and going. And that's a controversy that we see described in Acts and Paul's letters. And by the time we get to the 70 revolt, the Bar Kokhba thing from 68 to 70, everything kind of comes to a head. Rome kind of comes in and cracks down on all of the nonsense happening throughout Judea. The temple is destroyed. And one of the things that happens in the aftermath is Jews themselves, up until this time, Judaism had been this huge, incredibly diverse tradition. You had people practicing in 1,000 different ways and still seeing themselves as Jewish. After the temple gets destroyed, that no longer can fly as much because the central part of being Jewish, the temple, had been erased. So now you had to figure out what made you Jewish if there's no more temple. So when the Jews kind of gather back together, part of the way they impressively kind of find their identity is, okay, well, we're not these crazy people who think that a Messiah has come. So we're not the Christians. Those are not us. And so they start to draw a line between being Jewish and being Christian. It's not all the Jews, it's also the Christians. As the Christians also, the Jewish Christians, start to react about the temple's gone. We depended on the temple. We did sacrifice. We did keep the laws. We did do all this. They also start to pull away and figure out where their identity was. And their identity is now rooted in the person of Jesus and not in the rules that were becoming essential to Jewish identity. So what happens after the fall of the temple, and people spend their whole lives debating how this split happens, is you get the final kind of pulling apart of Judaism, what will become Rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity. There had been, up until this point, kind of intermittent persecutions from Rome. Some emperors didn't mind the Christians. Most emperors up until then saw the Christians as part of Judaism, so they were just kind of like, we always knew these crazy people were around. This is just a new form of being crazy. We kind of don't care. now, because Christianity had pulled itself away from Judaism and had marked itself as different, the persecutions ramped up. Judaism was at least an unknown known, or a known unknown, and now Christianity was this whole new thing. When things started to go badly in the empire, you had to find a scapegoat. Christianity made a nice scapegoat. It wouldn't be fair to say that there was just constant persecution. There wasn't. It was more, whenever things took a turn, when the economy went downhill, when they lost a battle, when the rain didn't fall, then they would kind of round up some people and make them sacrifice to the emperor, and everybody was sad. So then the house churches, many of them moved literally underground. When we go to the Holy Land, one of the things you'll see is evidence that people were worshiping in literal caves and catacombs and cisterns under the earth in places of persecution. So, because it was safer. During this time, bishops wrote letters that we still have. Irenaeus wrote letters, Ignatius wrote letters, that kind of lay out the tension between concern for the safety of the church, making sure people would survive, and concern for witnessing to a faith that would necessitate them kind of taking a bold stance and risking their own lives versus the need to survive so the church could continue to witness in the future. So this kind of continual back and forth, and what do we do? Constantine converts to Christianity in 313. When this is happening, the Roman Empire is in serious decline. Things are not going great. Constantine is basically fighting to be the emperor in a big battle called Milvian Bridge. And he prays that God would send him a sign. Oh God, if you want me to become a Christian, let me win this battle. And he sees a cross in the sky, and he's like, oh, that's great. Cool. Okay, we're Christians now. So Constantine doesn't convert at this point. He's not baptized until his deathbed. But he does legalize Christianity. He does not make it the national religion. He just legalizes it. Church comes out of hiding and immediately kind of starts to build the institution. And I want to be clear that there are good and bad things about institution building. The conversion of Constantine is one of those incredibly controversial things in church history. Do we think it was good? Do we think it was bad? Yeah, it's kind of both.
And when was that about?
313.
So, for the early Christians,
Yes.
their religion was mostly based on that Jesus was crucified and then rose again.
Mm-hmm.
So not really the little teaching, do this or live this way or that way. It was mostly that belief that death is not longer over us or something like that was the major.
Yeah,
the
I mean,
core for Christianity.
it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what exactly they thought the major tenets were. Again, because they were so diverse. So every little house church kind of had its own little take because they weren't organized in any sort of way. And we do know certain things. We know early on the letter from Clement, one of the bishops. So we know a lot of the letters from the bishops do have instructions about how to live. So you're not supposed to be a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be a soldier. Part of that we think was practical. To be a soldier, you had to sacrifice to the emperor.
Mhm.
So right away, that's a no-go. You couldn't be an actor, which was my favorite. You can't be an actor because it was thought that that involved lying. And as a good Christian, you had to live in the truth, right? You were expected to abstain from alcohol. I'm trying to think what others. So there were, particularly in the letters from the bishops that we have from that time period, there were instructions on ethical behavior. But it wasn't, like some of the times when Paul will stray into, like, treat your wife this way, get married or don't get married. It wasn't that. It was more, it wasn't, this is how you set up your life. It was, this is how you live day to day. Because again, the expectation was Jesus is coming back probably next week. So it was a short time period. So we don't start thinking long-term or structurally until the legalization. And then because they realized they had to start building something, because now they didn't have the excuse of like just survival, the kind of focus changed. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So when Constantine legalizes the church, he says, okay, you guys, everybody's all over the place. You've got people saying one thing, you've got people saying another thing. If I'm going to let you have any sort of like, power in this here empire, you're going to need to get your ducks in a row. I suggest you call everyone together and you establish some ground rules. So we have the what are called the ecumenical councils. Constantine calls the first one. We talked about this in the Nicene Creed. The definition of an ecumenical council is a council where the entire church comes together. Here's the kicker. Different denominations believe that there have been in history different numbers of these over time.
We weren't in that party, so it couldn't have been one.
Right. We as Anglicans, this is also a crazily controversial church history thing that you would not think would be controversial, and yet we as Anglicans technically recognize 7. Roman Catholics recognize, I think, 21.
Wow.
The latest being Vatican II, and I don't know what the Synod for Synodality is. I think it's a synod. But you have to respect anybody who's having a synod for synodality. That's just amazing. And not something we as Anglicans could pull off. However, I think it's either 21 or 22 that the Roman Catholics think. But the Orthodox would say there are 14. I think most Protestants would say there have been 4. It's a whole thing. So for our purposes, we're only going to talk about the first 4.
Is there any chance that the first 4 were all recognized by all those groups?
Yeah, I mean, everyone kind of agrees.
I'm like, where does that start branching? Do we kind of have?
I actually have a diagram of this.
Oh, that would be fun.
That's cool.
A diagram of church history shown as a river.
Oh, that's cool.
Somewhere, yeah. Because everybody's together and then people start branching.
Yeah.
But then there are disagreements about when, if I left you or you left me or you really left us because we had the one true faith. Like, it's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Betcha.
Nicaea, as
If
we...
you go back far enough, there are some people, I guess, that everybody considers like a father of their church or something. So, like, certain writers span the gap.
Right.
Oh.
Unless,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, after the disciples, there
Right.
are certain writers that.
unless you're some of these evangelicals, like some of the evangelicals are like, well, before Martin Luther, everybody was in sin. Or before the Baptists, everybody was in sin.
Oh,
And it's
my
like,
goodness.
wow, it's bold.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
That's exceedingly bold.
Yeah, that's just a lot. So, Council of Nicaea, 325, which we've talked about, it establishes the date for Easter. So the way we calculate Easter was established at Nicaea. It condemns Arianism,
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
the notion that Jesus was born at some point and was just a really smart guy that God kind of adopted at some point. And Nicaea said, no, Jesus has always been part of God.
What did you call that?
Arianism. That one's easy to remember because of Arian.
Yeah.
It also dealt with some internal disciplinary stuff for the first time. Again, we're kind of organizing the church. One of the things Nicaea said is you can only have one bishop per geographic area, called a diocese. If I'm a bishop and I'm at this end of the table, and Cyril's over there, and she's the bishop of that end of the table, and I want to come and do a marriage in her diocese, I have to ask her permission. Because them's the rules since 323. I am not allowed to go, and people throw down over this. I'm not allowed to go and like scoop up her priests, her parishioners, her clergy. That is such a huge party foul. I'm not allowed. This is my diocese. That's her diocese. Nicaea encouraged standing for prayer. When you pray, you should stand up.
But parishioners can move? Parishioners can move?
Parishioners can move, yes. Okay. But I can't go and like grab.
Okay.
That's no good.
Cyril's gonna have a party. She says, we're the best.
Mm-hmm.
Come see us. Come on over. I'm gonna drag you. No.
Yeah.
What happens if, as far as penalties go?
Get kicked out.
Oh, was that all?
Lose your job. Well, I mean, now you get kicked out. Then you would have like gotten run out of town and put on a stake probably.
So politics became well ingrained.
Oh yeah. I mean, and to be clear, there have always been politics in the church.
Politics, yeah.
Yes.
But now there's a rule that this is the foul.
Yeah. This is how we're going to work. Second ecumenical council is Constantinople, held at Constantinople. It doesn't go great. Lots of people don't show up. People are disgruntled. A couple of fights break out.
Can you say the time?
I don't have a date for Constantinople. I think it's like 370 something. It reiterates the condemnation of Arianism, but also condemns Sabellianism, and that is the belief that Jesus is basically God in a human suit.
And humans what?
In a human suit. So Jesus is not really human, just sort of appears human, has a human-like affect. And they were like, nope, that's not right either. And then we get to Ephesus, which is 400. That one I remember. Now we're denouncing Nestorianism, which is the separation between Christ's human and divine natures, and it devalues the role of Mary. And Ephesus is where Mary is proclaimed the Theotokos, or the God-bearer. And that is going to be important in the kind of idea, the kind of like notion of the incarnation. Chalcedon is where they kind of sort things out. So Chalcedon comes in 423, and there's a group, they're literally brothers and a sister. They're called the Cappadocian Fathers, and they're a group of monks and an abbess from Turkey. Well, it's now Turkey. And they come forward and they say, okay, we've figured this out. We have a good way of explaining the incarnation. And it's still in the prayer book. It's called the Cappadocian Definition. It's not clear by any stretch, but it does kind of, again, lay out the guardrails for what we're talking about when we talk about Christology, at least. And when they kind of push that forward, everyone's like, okay, now we kind of have a hold on what Christ was. Christ was co-eternal. Christ was of a human nature and a divine nature. They weren't separate. They weren't commingled. They were just kind of together. Something called the hypostatic union. And that kind of like solved the debates over what was the incarnation. The reason the debates over the incarnation were so important, and why I'm telling you about all of these ridiculous heresies, is because, again, for us, everything's about the incarnation. To hold, for example, that Jesus was only God in a spacesuit is to kind of say, like Irenaeus, if it's not assumed, then it's not redeemed. That God was just sort of like pretending to be human, and so God doesn't really experience what it is to be human in Christ, and so the whole thing was an illusion. And so for to like hold that Christ never takes on a divine or a human will is to also say that our will isn't redeemed somehow. So for them to finally say, okay, it's taken like 100 years, but we finally think we have the kind of boundaries of the mystery that we're talking about when we talk about the incarnation. Kind of goes to show you how important they thought the incarnation was, and how impactful it was to the rest of the worldview, both about God and humanity and kind of what we believe. So there were some more disciplinary canons that were worked out. Chalcedon did a lot of work. You are not allowed to buy or sell ordinations. You are not allowed to be resident in 2 dioceses at once. This is actually still the case. So this actually came up in a thing this month. When I moved here from Missouri, I had to get a letter from my old bishop sent to my new bishop, transferring my residence. So now I'm resident here in central New York. If I ever went back to Missouri and wanted to do a wedding, I would have to get permission from that old bishop again, or whoever is in charge of Missouri, because I'm no longer resident there. I can't operate in 2 places at once. Somebody has to be like watching me. There's no dual citizenship. Yeah. And that's still the case.
Was that super stressful? It sounds like it might be.
Actually, it was slightly stressful. It was only slightly, mostly it's routine. It was only slightly stressful because that bishop didn't like me, but it's mostly routine. So, you're not allowed to, speaking of that bishop not liking me, you're not allowed to malign your bishop without a cause. You're not allowed to take internal church matters to secular courts.
Oh, interesting.
You're supposed to go through internal church rules first. Other councils follow, mostly trying to patch up the schisms that are beginning to erupt in the church. As the empire breaks apart, as the common language of Greek kind of bleeds away, and we get the West beginning to speak Latin, and the East still speaking Greek, the East and the West part of the church no longer can communicate. And so literally what happens is they get into a fight over the correct translation and meaning of a phrase in the creed. And because they're unable to come to a conclusion about it, we get the split between what becomes the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, with one side speaking Greek and the other side speaking Latin.
What was that?
I know.
It's okay.
Is it persona? I know the word. So the word in Greek is homoousios, which means persona. The problem was it can mean mask. They were reading it as homoousis, which has an iota in it, which means a different thing. which means like perception of a person. So these are two different things. And so they were having this horrible fight, literally because of the difference of an iota. So the phrase like 1 iota of difference comes from this fight.
That's amazing.
Doesn't matter
Yep.
1 iota. That's funny.
Yep. So the schisms kept being called. The problem was no one person held enough kind of relational authority to pull everybody back together. We do get like the seventh, some of these we still pay attention to, like the Seventh Council reaffirms the validity of icons, because the iconoclasts at that point had gone through the East and were smashing the faces of icons. And but, you know, as the empire breaks apart, so does the church. So the idea of this kind of one united worldwide faithful is kind of fracturing. But Christianity continues to spread in huge variety. It kind of is being picked up by cultures that are way different than that of Palestinian Judea of the first century. So around this time, about 500, give or take, Rome sends out missionaries to England for the first time.
Oh, yes. Hayden.
That's the guy who built the wall.
Right, in England.
Yes. So Augustine of Canterbury becomes the first bishop of England. He is sent from Rome to be the first bishop. He becomes Bishop of Canterbury in 597.
What's his name again? What's his name again?
Augustine.
Okay.
His job, he has one job, is to convert the king, King Aelfward of Kent, who had married a nice Christian lady named Bertha, who had been sent by the Pope, Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great got that name because he also instituted wonderful reforms like Gregorian chant. That was him. Enforcing literacy among the clergy, doing a lot of missionary work, telling clergy not to steal stuff. Generally, good pope.
Let's see.
Yeah, good pope for this time. So Augustine does his job. He converts the king in 597. And soon he's gotten a number of missionaries along through southern England. Ireland and Scotland are going to get their own missionaries coming down from the north, which they get missionized in a different sort of way, which is why the two groups don't like each other. Anyway, England is not unified until way later. So part of the reason Aelfward is so excited about missionaries coming is he thinks this is a great way for him to gain control over all of England. He's very excited. If you want to know more about this, the Venerable Bede wrote the history of Christianity in England in the 8th century, and it might be worth a perusal. So Christianity grows in the British Isles, but again, Christianity, until mass communication, is incredibly diverse. It was diverse during the time of Roman persecutions with the little house churches, and it's diverse in the British Isles too. The rest of Western Europe kind of grows through the medieval times with the kind of structure that we know, right? Parishes and dioceses and bishops. And the British Isles maintains Christianity in a different way. It has monasteries. By the time Augustine lands in Kent, monasteries have already landed in Scotland and Ireland and had set up the monastery at Iona and had already started importing their monastic traditions down from the north. And so Augustine kind of fed off of this. He instituted Christianity that was centered around schools, centered around monasteries and abbeys, and centers of learning and things like that. So the church culture that develops is fairly different, a little less hierarchical. There's definitely a hierarchy, but it's in a different way than the Christian culture that develops throughout of Western Europe. I don't want to make this sound sweet and progressive. Sometimes there's a take that Celtic Christianity is very like the answer to all of our problems. It was pretty harsh. If monks talked during dinner and they had to do penance, they would stand in water, cold water, it's Ireland, with arms outstretched for hours as their penance to mortify the flesh. Had a way, they were like hardcore. They also tended to have a greater attachment to nature, greater knowledge of the seasons, a greater openness to women leadership because they were so remote. Wasn't a lot of people. They developed their own liturgical rites. They have something called the Sarum Rite, which was their own liturgical practice that grew up at the Salisbury Cathedral. Just because they were so far out on the hinterland. And it was difficult to communicate with them. So, if you wanted to tell somebody in Kent that they were doing something wrong and you were in Rome, it was going to take like a couple months to get them that message.
Didn't give them the message, not even until
Yeah.
they do anything about it.
It was hard. So they were kind of so off on their own that there was a synod of synodality. The Synod of Whitby was called to settle the conflicts that were beginning to arise as communication and transportation got better. So in 664, the Pope was like, we have to rein them in, and called a synod to kind of get the British Christians on the same page with everybody else. They had their own date of Easter. One of the sticking points was they had their own haircut for monks. And Rome was like, nope. Hilda of Whitby, who was the abbess at Whitby and who was basically like the premier stateswoman of her day. She wrote a lot of music. She pretty much did everything. And she's a great saint of the church. She convened the meeting and like negotiated both sides. She's great. But the sense of the British being sort of like out there doing their own thing is going to persist. So by the time we get to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that tension is back. And by the time we get to Henry VIII, our buddy, before he even arrives on the scene, a couple of things have happened. We already have the beginning of reform on the continent. So we have like Jan Hus in Bohemia pushing the Bible in the vernacular, pushing salvation by grace alone. We have English reformers like Wycliffe and the Lollards in the 1300s pushing for reform. Wycliffe was the first person who wanted to translate the scriptures into English to help literacy rates in English. He also thought the church should forfeit all money and property. And he got a whole ecumenical council just to condemn him. And he was burned at the stake.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's okay. He's a saint now, so he's feeling better. I think he helped contribute to the Psalter we use in the prayer book. So that's kind of in the run up to Henry VIII. And also the papacy is not going super great. This is not a Gregory the Great time for the Pope. This is a Pope and anti-Pope, an anti-anti-Pope moment for the papacy. This is the period of time, if you remember from church history or from Western Civ, where you've got, one Pope, and then you have another Pope in Avignon, and then you've got the papal exile, and then you've got 3 popes at once. Like, it's a whole mess. It is not instilling confidence in the people. And you've got, kind of like a level of corruption in the local parishes that, again, not filling anyone with confidence. But here's the thing. In the structure of the world, if we're in England, and Sonia's the king, you're going to be the king.
Cool.
And I am the clergy person, and I have stolen your mug. There's nothing you can do about it. Because I'm a clergy person, and I have right of clergy. This is something that still exists, actually, in English common law.
The right of clergy.
The right of clergy. If you're condemned to die, and you can recite a passage of scripture, you can claim the right of clergy, and they can't execute you. Because clergy do not answer to the king's laws. Clergy are only under the authority of the Pope.
I was going to get to you again.
Right.
So how did
Sure, that's
did
what they
Wyatt get burned at the stake then?
Wycliffe?
Yeah, Wycliffe, thank you.
Oh, he was the church did that.
Church condemned him.
Yeah,
church
he got
said
condemned by the
it's not
church.
from the
Not the
church.
king.
Yeah, not the king. King didn't care. Clergy do not pay taxes. The money, the land, all of the people who work for the church, the monks, the nuns, the sextons, the you name it who work for the church, all of that wealth and those people accountable only to Rome. And so if you've got clergy running amok, the king can't do anything. And all of the money that goes to the church, the king also can't touch.
Until Henry VIII comes along.
Right.
With Cromwell.
Yeah, he's like,
Which
I'm done
is
with this.
quite a situation when, like, the Black Plague comes and then the king runs out of money. And, now you've got people starving in the streets, are crazy poor, and are watching the church just sitting on all of this money. And watching the clergy doing who knows what because they're only accountable to the Pope, who is way, way far away. It's not it's not a tenable situation. All of which is to say, a lot of times the kind of joke about the foundation of the Anglican Church is that, well, Henry just wanted a divorce. There was a lot leading up to it. He didn't technically want a divorce. He wanted something else. But by the time we get there, everyone is very grumpy. Everyone is very on edge. This didn't come out of nowhere, where Henry VIII woke up one day and was like, I don't like my wife. Everyone is really put out with the Pope. He just seems to be over there with no cares in the world, has a ton of money, no accountability. He's ordering kings around with their armies and telling them to do things and invade places. And it's just getting on everyone's nerves. So by the time we get to Henry, and then I promise we'll be done. Henry, in his early life, actually wrote a whole book explaining why Martin Luther was wrong and going to hell. This won him the papal awarded title, Defender of the Faith.
Yeah, I remember saying.
The monarch of England still holds this. So when Charles is crowned in May, he will be entitled Defender of the Faith. But then he marries Catherine of Aragon, who had been married to his brother, but then his brother died. And Catherine of Aragon, after about 15 years, did not have a son. And Henry, who was, to his credit, very religious, like in a kind of warped way, but he was pretty religious. And he begins to think that this is probably because Catherine had been married to his brother and that the annulment the Pope had given him wasn't enough. And so God was punishing him. And he also thinks, wow, the Pope is being really unhelpful to me. The first annulment the Pope gave me didn't work. The Pope is not returning my phone calls now. What am I going to do? So Henry goes back to the Pope and he demands a divorce. However, at the same time, Catherine's brother, who is one of the kings in the Italian region, has a lovely army surrounding Rome, where the Pope is. And so the Pope is not taking calls from Henry VIII regarding divorce. And so Henry kind of looks at the situation. He looks at the kind of lay of the land, and he's like, and he also notices the amount of money in the monasteries, the amount of land that they hold. I think one estimate, monasteries held well over 50% of the land in England at the time of the
Wow.
dissolution. It was an insane amount. And he was like, I'm not doing this anymore. So Henry
Sends out Cromwell.
Henry declares himself by act of parliament head of the church in England. And he ends the Pope's authority in England, and in a separate act, he seizes the monasteries and puts them under his control. That's essentially all Henry does. Henry doesn't care about the kind of European Reformation. Anne Boleyn, who he marries after Catherine, did. She, from what we can tell, like gave Henry the prayer book in English that she had gotten from the continent. She kind of talked to him about Martin Luther. She brought him around on some things. She was deeply invested in the new kind of ideas around Christianity, but Henry never made any sort of major changes to the church aside from, I'm in charge now. I'm the captain now. And he appoints Thomas Cranmer to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. So from the time of Augustine in 5 whatever, the head of the Church of England has always been the Archbishop of Canterbury. And now Henry has claimed the right to appoint that archbishop. The monarch still appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, and Thomas Cranmer,
Still?
still,
Kind of interesting and crazy and
right?
Yeah.
The Tudors were very political and savvy, and they could make plans on a dime.
Well, we're going to talk about the kind of problems the Anglican Communion runs into next week. But so Cranmer allows worship in English. He writes the Book of Common Prayer, which we'll talk about more in a couple weeks. The kind of broad outline of what we have now, all Thomas Cranmer. And in some ways, he should get more credit for what he did. The rhythm of the collects, in particular, the kind of one long run-on sentence thing, the style that we're used to, all him. The Great Litany, which we will use next Sunday, he wrote. It was the first thing he wrote, and we still use it. Things don't go well under Mary. She tosses Thomas Cranmer onto the fire, which is too bad for him. It's not until the Elizabethan settlement that things calm down. When Elizabeth comes to the throne, things are in an uproar. We had Henry kind of move the church away from Rome. Mary emphatically move it back for a couple years and kill a lot of people doing it. And Elizabeth, when she took the throne, she had a group of kind of hardcore Puritans who wanted to go full Calvin, like any trace of Catholicism, scrub it out. And then there was another group who wanted to stay with Catholicism, and Elizabeth said, I don't care. She passed a law that said, basically, you can believe whatever you want. I don't care. But when you worship in public, you will worship using this book. All right, that's it. And if you want to hold an office in this church, or in this country, you will certify that you worship in public using this book. You can believe whatever you want in the silence of your heart, and that's great, but you will worship in public using this book.
It's the Common Prayer.
The Book of Common Prayer. Yep. This didn't stop huge anti-Catholic sentiment or the entire English Civil War with the Puritans, but it did do a couple things. It did set a precedent for how the Anglican Church continues to kind of find peace and dodge. and how we see ourselves as a big church. It did kind of put the onus of explaining our faith onto a set of actions rather than a set of beliefs. And it did a little bit preserve England from the kind of horrendous religious wars that were sweeping the continent. And then, of course, Elizabeth sends out colonizers, and they set up the colonies, and those colonies have their own churches. And so next week we will talk about what the church looked like when it showed up here.
You did
Yay!
it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Yes.
During the time of Mary Tudor, it was her nickname was Bloody Mary.
It was Bloody
Okay.
Mary. Yeah.
When we went to England, we went to London, and it was very interesting. We just like we're going to Palestine, we're going to Israel, we're going to check all this, do all this research.